What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. The removal of Hela and Clog from the meta has left Agent Venom and to a lesser extent War Machine Legion decks as the dominant two strains as people still try to figure out what can actually compete with those two. For this reason, they are going to be a decent amount of the first part of this video. I'm going to give you that warning now. You can use the timestamps to skip past them if you don't want to watch me talking about the intricacies of the various Agent Venom and War Machine decks that we're going to be looking at for the first few bits, okay? All right. With all of that said, I still consider this deck the baseline of the format, but I will say that my personal success with it has dropped off a little bit as it has become more well-known and people are building more specifically to actually deal with it. This deck is a very, very straightforward deck. I think that for most people, this would be my number one recommendation because it is not just powerful, but easy to play. This is a deck that really tells you what it wants you to do. Your play lines are pretty obvious most of the time, and the only things that are really going to confuse you are what you need to be doing with the placement of your points on your final turn, which, with all due respect, is something that every deck in Marvel Snap has to deal with. This is a deck that does not add any complexity and has a ton of just baseline power built into it. Agent Venom with Iron Man is obviously unbelievable. There are many situations in which it is just a snap if your hand does not contain many of the AV targets to just have Agent Venom on turn 2. There is not a single bad card in here. Honestly, this deck reminds me a lot of when Thena first came out and she went into the Iron Man, like, Mysterio, Mockingbird and Sasquatch deck, where it was just like, you are free rolling all of these points. And that is what this deck is most similar to. It is just fundamentally operating at a higher level than most of its competition. And that is not necessarily a problem, because I think that what I would do to contrast this and Hela is that this is a deck that cares about the board. You are playing actual Marvel Snap. There are cards that interact with them. There is interplay going on. Your Cosmo is a very important tool that you have to use and you don't want to throw away willy-nilly. This is a deck that has some play to it. So even though I think it's very, very powerful, I don't think it has the same deleterious effect on metagames that something like Hela and Clog did just in terms of playstyle. I do think that in terms of power, it is one of the stronger decks we've had in a while, and Agent Venom is as strong of a Season Pass card that we've seen since Hope Summers and maybe even including her. This is perhaps the best Season Pass card I can remember in a very long time, and I do think that is worth explicitly pointing out here because the power of Agent Venom will lead to a lot of complaints about this metagame being pretty pay to win. Before we cover the other Agent Venom decks, let's talk about the other elephant in the room, I guess, and that is Storm War Machine Legion. I think a lot of people are far more upset about Storm War Machine Legion being an important part of this metagame than they are about the Agent Venom decks. I worry about the direction that could lead because Storm War Machine Legion is powerful. I don't think it's stronger than the Agent Venom decks. It is a very annoying thing to happen to you, but I worry that if they nerf that and then don't touch AV, then suddenly we're looking at a metagame where AV is the only thing you can actually do, and that is a little bit iffy to me. The other thing, though, that these decks have going for them is just an incredible amount of flexibility and player agency. When you look at this deck, and keep in mind, the Human Torch here is a flex spot. You can go either Human Torch or Alioth. Those are the two most played versions of the deck. I have no real opinion on the 11th or 12th card in between them. I think I value Alioth a little bit more because I feel the impact of it more, but I do think there is something to be said about not running 2 6-drops in these decks. It's really up to you. What this deck is trying to leverage is player agency combined with a game-winning combo. You have a lot of really aggressive snaps on Storms that don't necessarily imply that you're actually going to be able to combo off, but instead that you are just going to win that lane normally and then like War Machine and Infinite down, right? There are so many different play lines that you have that all sort of spark off of having Madam Web and Storm, that when you have one of them, it's honestly just the kind of thing that you can build your game plan around, and then Flowchart expands like a spider web because you have so many different options available in front of you. This is a powerful deck, but I do worry that if I were to recommend this to someone who's like struggling to climb to infinite, they would not have success with it. Not because it's not strong, but because it is very hard to play correctly. There's all sorts of sequencing things, and not even just sequencing, like figuring out where you need to put your stuff, predicting what your opponent is going to do. Where does my Cosmo need to go? What is my opponent's range here? Where if you're not really steeped in the metagame, this deck does get a little bit worse for you. I think it's very powerful, but I do think of the decks that play Storm War Machine Legion, this is the more complex one. This one's a little bit less complex. This is a deck that I just really love playing. It's perfectly fine, it's perfectly good, but I love playing my little dopey mid-range decks that just have an I win card attached to them. I do think that if I was forced to choose between the two of them, I would choose this one, but accept that I'm probably taking the 49% rather than the 51%. This deck, it's easier to play, it's a lot more straightforward, your plays are confusing and weird and hard to predict, and I played probably more games where I had no idea what the correct play was with this deck, but the thing about a deck that's like a dinky mid-range curve deck is the real strength of it is that it sometimes doesn't matter if you made the right play, you can just sort of power through it and win games by making just unexpected plays. It's hard to play around a Magneto in every location. It's hard to play around an Arrow in every location. It's just not an easy deck to play against. And of course, it has these very vicious Storm snaps where if you have the combo, you just win the game. Storm War Machine Legion, I think, has risen to the level of a problem. Capital A, capital P. And this is one of the two decks that I like the most in terms of how it works. If you're looking for something a little bit simpler, a little bit less complex, this is a great option for Storm War Machine Legion. Oh, and two notes here. This deck was cooked up by Ica. Shout out to Ica. And if you don't have Silk, Jeff is a perfectly good replacement and frankly might be better in the first place because it doesn't have the same weakness to when your opponents are also playing Scream stuff and or Craven stuff. Bet you didn't think you'd see a Grandmaster deck this early, did ya? Well, you are. This has actually been my most successful deck this season, as weird as that is to say, or at least since the patch. I can't really fully put into words why I think that is. I think I'm just good at decks that want to cover all three locations naturally. So the more a deck wants to do that, the more it vibes with me. And so having this like Mysterio at 10 power kind of deal, that deck that really wants to and has the power output to do that is the kind of deck that I tend to succeed with. And I think that's probably part of it. But I think another part of it is that this deck is actually just monstrously strong. It does bounce level numbers with better spread on it. The thing about bounce is that you're doing a lot of cool, awesome stuff when you bounce, but if your opponent has a 12 power Mysterio, it kind of doesn't matter that you're doing a lot of cool, awesome stuff when you bounce. That's two demons in every lane. Like, this is the kind of deck that can face down those decks, can run into them and beat them, and can do so in very confusing ways. There are genuinely a lot of ways to get screwed by locations in this deck, because you are fairly location-centric as a game plan goes. Your game plan tends to be like, all right, I need this card in this location, then I'm going to Grandmaster it to the middle. That's the kind of thing that can really get you messed up. Grandmaster here is mostly for Beast and Gwenpool, but don't forget that you can double trigger a Hitmonkey if you want to be able to put that into the middle and have maybe the largest Hitmonkey you've ever seen. I did that earlier today. It was 25 power. I won very easily because it was 25 power. That is generally the shape of this. You play it like a bounce deck. Don't be afraid to hold cards in your hand. Your whole thing is an explosive power turn. You do not need to feel pressured to curve out until it actually becomes clear that you will not be able to play the cards in your hand if you do not play them right now. That does mean you have to pay attention to what your draws are going to be, but honestly, I think this deck is both strong and surprisingly easy to play because of just how much it tells you, hey, don't worry about anything, just play a bunch of cards on turn 6, and that is going to be enough. And a lot of the time, it is correct. What the deck is telling you to do just by looking at it is exactly what you want to do with it. This deck is in a similar boat to the previous Gwenpool deck. I was also very successful with it, and it is just, again, it's a very straightforward. These are almost the same deck. They're taking the same route to a certain thing, and then arriving at different ways to get there. And the route this one is taking is the same points application. We have a Sera in here. We are really, though, but this deck and the previous deck are leveraging the best is being US Agent decks, because US Agent right now is incredibly strong. And US Agent, probably after Agent Venom, maybe after Cosmo, might be the best possible card to play against those, Iron Man decks, right? Like, you can do things with Agent Venom, obviously, that are, like, really busted. There's probably higher rated than US Agent. Cosmo defines this meta, probably to a higher degree than US Agent. But US Agent is really up there for me in terms of it is really important, vitally important, to find a good home for that card, and these last two decks are ways of doing that, because they are decks that have US Agent in them, because without that, it's very hard for you to deal with Iron Man. And you also have all of this other monstrous tech for that matchup, but you don't need to only be a tech deck because you are still playing a zillion points. You have less points than bounce decks, but you beat them in the heads up. You use this Invisible Woman to manipulate priority, Killmonger everything playing 1-drops. You have a ton of power because of Agent Venom, because of Mysterio, because of Gwenpool, because of Hitmonkey, and you have incredibly relevant tech cards like Rogue in a lot of matchups is going to be very, very important. This means that you are able to take your time, view the battlefield, build up the power of the cards in your hand, and then vomit them all. It's a very powerful strategy that I think is one of the easier decks to play and is very well positioned right now. I found this deck on Untapped, but Ica showed up in my chat, and so apparently this is the second Ica deck on this tier list. Arishem is a deck. I have not found the perfect configuration yet, but I have come to a couple conclusions about it. The first conclusion that I really just want to get on record about Arishem is I do not think Loki is good anymore, and if I were you, I would not be playing Loki in Arishem. I am much more comfortable playing basically everything else, or doing basically everything else that this deck wants to do. I just don't think you can afford playing a 2/2 that isn't that good at this point in time, especially because so many of these decks are built to be synergistic within themselves. Like, okay, cool, you got a Storm, that's awesome, but you don't have the other stuff that combos with it. Okay, cool, you got a Madam Web, that's awesome, but you don't have the other stuff that combos with it. Okay, cool, you got the Agent Venom deck from them, but theirs has 4 power and yours don't, right? Like, it's just not a great card right now, and I think even before this meta was like this, I was thinking it wasn't a great card, but now I'm becoming more and more convinced that Loki is just not the move in this deck. And I think that we need to really branch out as Arishem gamers, in as much as we are Arishem gamers. I don't want to speak for you, but I do think that it is important to keep in mind that, it's okay to get rid of Loki. Now, I'm not sure that the choices I've made in this deck are optimal. Super Scroll is in here because there's just a lot of really good ongoings right now, and getting those can be an important thing to do. Copying even a Madam Web can be really helpful. It copies a Madam Web and a Cosmo. There's some really useful stuff that can happen there. You can obviously also get copies of Claws and Iron Man out of the Agent Venom Iron Man deck. There's a lot that this card can do, and I think that usually means it's a good time to chuck it into Arishem and see if we can get some free wins. The rest of the deck is what you remember Arishem being. When you win, it's very powerful. When you lose, it's kind of sad, but it's also just very hard for your opponent to really understand what it is your range is, and your job as an Arishem gamer is to leverage that range. And now let's move into the US Agent section of our program. Remember how I talked about he was probably like the third or fourth most definitional card right now? The thing about US Agent is that he is one of the few ways to deal with Iron Man lanes that is not Cosmoable, which makes him immensely valuable as a card in this metagame context. Now, that's not to say if you don't have US Agent, you can't compete. It's just like, if you are trying to break this meta, if you are trying to beat the best decks, US Agent is your ingredient to get to that point. Where when we look at the best decks, it's Agent Venom Iron Man, it's various combinations of the Legion Lock deck. Both of them are great matchups for anyone playing US Agent, or at least he himself is a great card against both of those decks. He is the sort of tip of the spear for if you are trying to do something under the radar, if you're trying to play a little bit of a rogue deck, if you're trying to play something that isn't one of those two decks, US Agent is the starting point that I endorse the most. The card is absolutely bonkers in this context and is a great place to start. This deck was cooked up by Batman. It was originally not running US Agent. It became very clear over time that US Agent was kind of the move and had to be. And I just wanted to put it on here because, again, this is a deck that is not an Agent Venom deck, but it is able to compete with them thanks to various sources of points and US Agent. This is my personal build of US Agent deck. I'm trying to take advantage of US Agent and also use Ajax and Hazmat and things like that. You might remember this from a video I did recently. After the patch, this was one of the first decks that I played, and I made the changes of putting Scorpion and Copycat in here, and I was very tickled to see that people picked the deck up from that, the exact 12, after I made the changes, and then started playing that exact list. At the time of me filming this video, it's got like 120 games in top 10% infinite. Most of them are not me, and it has about a 59% win rate over that time period. And I think that is, that tickles me a little bit. Like, I'm not really a brewer per se, but I am happy that like literally the exact 12 of this that I put together after the patch seems to be succeeding very well. And I really do enjoy that. I think that this is a very solid rogue deck, is sort of how I think about it. It's a deck that is trying to leverage US Agent and Hazmat to keep Iron Man lanes under control. A deck that is trying to leverage Shadow King to keep various green power threats under control. And a deck that unfortunately does have weaknesses to well-played Cosmos. That is the major thing holding this deck back, is just how many of its final turns want to be a 2-drop, a 2-drop, and a 2-drop, and 2 of those 2-drops are on reveals that Cosmo really beats. There are some issues with the fundamental way this deck matches up into the Cosmo decks, but I do generally like it, and it is currently my Ajax deck of choice. Just a couple of AV decks to clear out this section. I wanted to talk about these sort of towards the end, because they're either a little bit untested or have a little bit lower stats than the AV decks that I think truly represent tier 1 AV. But these are also very unique and interesting ways to use the card. The first one is one that Gnome and Jimmy cooked up. I've seen Shuri Enjoyer playing it a little bit. It is a very interesting Agent Venom, basically aggro deck. And I think that that is the draw for a deck like this, is that you get to just say, here is what I'm doing. These are my points. Can you beat my points? And I think a lot of people really like that. Like, there's no ambiguity. There's no like, oh, I'm going to wait till turn 6 and explode. You're playing freaking Havoc. You're playing actual Havoc. And that means you're putting a bunch of numbers on the board. You got maybe a Cosmo that can move around off of Madam Web, but the rest of this, numbers. It's all numbers. And I think there's a certain type of player that just really loves doing that. If you are that type of player and you want to opt into 8 million 50-50s at the end of every game because you have to figure out what your moves are going to be and then what your other moves are going to be and then where your Doctor Strange is going to move stuff and then how big your Havoc is going to be and then what your opponent is going to do. If you really want to do that, I think this is a great option. Agent Venom Bounce has fallen down the list as other Agent Venom decks have become more effective and efficient at dealing not only with what it does, but with other things in the metagame. The main issue AV Bounce runs into is that there is another AV deck that runs Iron Man and Cosmo, which makes it very difficult to win, and then other decks that are building to beat that deck tend to have also plausible matchups into AV Bounce, like AV Sera, for example, is perfectly able to just Killmonger the crap out of you and beat you on points. And so AV Bounce ends up being the sort of left out in the cold of the AV decks right now. Perfectly acceptable, perfectly playable, not a bad deck. There are just other decks in a similar lane to it that have a better contextual matchup with the rest of what people are playing. I don't think that this is the wrong thing to play, just a little bit, not ideal. Next up is Silver Surfer. Now, you might be looking at me like, KM, what is this weird build of Silver Surfer? I'll tell you. This build was piloted by Teebs to a 6-0 finish in the North American Content Creator qualifying bracket, and this was not a bracket full of scrubs. Many of my friends who are very good players competed in this tournament. Zombies Go Nom Nom, Yo Woody, Husky Puppies, KX, Dexter, Cozy. None of them 6-0'd, but Teebs did. And I think it's worth highlighting what exactly the choices that were made here in order to achieve that result. Because I do think that it's worthy of a shout out, and it is a very interestingly constructed deck. To me, what this deck resembles more than anything else is just pure points. That's all we're doing. We're doing numbers. We would like to do numbers. We have no Killmonger at all. All we're doing is putting numbers on the board, threatening 3 lanes, and winning it with points. Grandmaster Absorbing Man gives us some really incredible replication tools. You have the ability to Grandmaster your Broods, you have the ability to Grandmaster your Silver Sables, you have the ability to Grandmaster of course, you have the ability to Grandmaster your Silver Surfers. There's just a lot that card can do right now, but basically what this deck is saying is all the other Surfer decks have too much interaction. They're too Killmonger Nova-y. What if it's just numbers? And I think that's actually a pretty coherent metagame read right now. When you look at what everyone else is playing, just numbers actually sounds like a really good idea. So congratulations to Teebs. Huge shout out to them. And I really think that maybe there might be something worth investigating here. If you're still on the fence, I also think normal Surfer builds are perfectly acceptable. Now, as far as Darkhawk decks go, I'm opting to show you the more interesting one, and that's not because it's the more interesting one, it's because the other Darkhawk deck is just the Iron Man deck with Agent Venom, and it's worse, right? So I'm not going to show you the Darkhawk deck that is the worse version of the better deck. What I'm going to show you is the Darkhawk deck that is trying to do something different. This one is cooked up by Jet. I believe he is top 2, top 3 in the world right now. He's been playing this a decent amount, and it is a relatively interesting and strong deck. There's a bunch of really cool stuff you can do with Misery Phoenix Force that has been, I think, relatively underexplored by players like me. Like, for example, did you know that if you play a card in a lane and then put a Phoenix Force in that lane, and that card has an on reveal, and then you Misery that lane, the card comes back as the Phoenix Force card and then does not die. So like, let's say you have a Cassandra Nova and a Phoenix Force in a lane. You play Misery on that lane. Cassandra Nova happens again, dies, comes back as Phoenix Force, and then that one doesn't die because it's trying to kill off Phoenix Force, but that card is Cassandra Nova now. There's a bunch of weird stuff that this card does. Another thing, you can't Grandmaster your Misery because I guess they coded it that way. Like, they just don't want you to be able to do that. I think it's just because, like, something they put in because they were afraid of, like, infinite loops or whatever. But as far as I know, you can't do that either. And there's just a bunch of weird, intricate interactions going on in this deck that I don't think have really been fully explored by many people. And that is, like, the perfect marker of a Jet deck, because every Jet deck is kind of like that, right? This is the guy who wrote like a 40-page Phoenix Force manifesto, and like 15 pages were just like, here's a weird interaction. That's like, if you're that kind of player, this might be the deck for you. I am continually amazed at the ability Destroy has to just keep frickin' chugging along. It's Honestly unbelievable. Like, I will never go a day without playing against Destroy, and that is just incredible. Like, it doesn't matter how good it is or how bad it is, it's basically always the same amount of medium, but when it rolls well, it beats the crap out of people. That's just a fact. It just whips ass when it rolls well, and that's just, like, the dream is so real with this deck. Like, the amount of points you can do is so incredible if you get everything right. It's just a little bit inconsistent right now, and I don't know how to fix that, because a lot of decks, it's like, oh, okay, it's inconsistent, let's introduce another thing that makes it more consistent. But the problem this deck has is that it needs cards early. You don't just need to draw Deadpool, you need it early, really early. You need to draw like Deadpool Hulkbuster. You need like very specific things to happen in order to compete with the power output of a lot of these other decks that need less specific things to happen. All of that said, I have absolutely nothing against Destroy. I think it is a perfectly acceptable, perfectly functional deck. Probably the baseline for what I would consider acceptable and okay to play. This is a zoo list courtesy of Derek and Barzy. It's basically just saying like, hey, Gilgamesh, not really what we need right now. Super Skrull is what we need right now. Deck is just really trying to be one of the good homes for Super Skrull, and that's really what it's about. There are a lot of decks that are sort of set up to be decks where what they're trying to do is be a good home for a tech card. We talked about this with US Agent earlier, where it's just like, what are these decks that are playing US Agent trying to do? They're trying to be good homes for that card. They're trying to provide points outside of it and then use that card in the matchups where it's relevant, right? And Zoo is usually a good home for that. It's not as good of a home for US Agent because of, obviously, Khazar and Blue Marvel and Mockingbird and all that. But it's a very good home if you just like have a tech card and you're like, I think this tech card is really good right now. Let's play a deck that can do points, and then I will play the tech card and win games with the tech card. And so we have Shadow King here, we have Super Skrull here, and Zoo is a good shell for those cards. And that is really what's happening here. I think that this is probably preferable to playing a normal Zoo deck, but again, just like with Surfer, I think you can probably play normal Zoo too. Like, I think that's just normal Zoo with Shadow King is probably totally fine. I've seen a lot more discard recently, and I can't really put my finger on why, because I don't think it's the kind of thing that I would want to be playing, but I will concede it's possible that I'm missing something because it actually has a fairly reasonable win rate at top 10% infinite. What discard does well is pretty much just points, and it's usually pretty hard to interact with. It's not as good if your opponent is able to outpoint you. And I think that's the ultimate downfall of this deck, is that you are very liable to get outpointed, not just by the Iron Man decks, but also by like the kind of decks that can just like, Sera AV you. A lot of Agent Venom decks are very able to get to your level in terms of power and beat you. I'm not saying that makes this deck a bad decision, but what I am saying is that you're gonna run into people who might be good enough to know that going in and start aggressively bully snapping you. And I think that is a real risk. The thing that keeps you in those games mostly are cards like Moon Knight and cards like Gambit. Like, you are not going to win those games if you aren't playing a little bit recklessly. That's the best tip I have for you, is that sometimes you just have to play recklessly if you want to win those unfavored matchups. Because otherwise, if they just get to play normally and they're bullying you, you don't really get to stay in those games. A lot of people are playing this version of the War Machine Legion list, and I get it, but I will say that I'm not overly happy with it. I don't think this deck does much that's good except win mirrors. It seems like this deck is extremely good into the other War Machine Legion lists, and then the rest of the time I would basically rather be playing the other War Machine Legion lists. It's just not really all there, I think. There's too many little different pieces that this deck is trying to make work at the same time. Now, that said, this has been true of things that ended up being good before. I'm not saying there's no hope here at all, but what I am saying is that this deck, it feels like, needs more time in the oven right now. There are plenty of things you can do that are like this, but currently stronger because they've had more time to be polished. This right now, I just can't vouch for in the same way. It's fine, but I think it's a distant third in terms of War Machine Legion decks. I also see people playing this deck, and it's not bad per se, but it seems to match up mostly as a bad version of other decks, right? Like, when you look at this deck and you compare it to, say, the AV Iron Man deck, one of these decks is doing the thing it does better than the other. And what this deck has as a competitive advantage is very much, it's real, it has this competitive advantage of being a disruptive deck. But what that means is if your disruption didn't matter, which you have no way of knowing, you're probably going to lose on points to the other decks, right? And that's a big problem. And so you don't know if your disruption mattered or not. I actually tend to think that, like, putting cards in AV decks is actually pretty good. You blank an AV draw, that's really important. You Black Widow them, that's really important. But it's just not really enough to take you over the top most of the time. That is my experience playing against this deck. It just has not felt like a viable threat. Another Derek and Barzy joint, Namora Tempo to me feels like the exact kind of deck that good players are like, wow, this is so good, but ultimately it matches up a little bit not great and they're kind of skill diffing. I think this is a perfectly acceptable deck. I think both Derek and Barzy are very great players, and I think that a lot of what they do is build mid-range decks that are confusing for their opponents to play against and then leverage that confusion, and this is definitely one of those things. So if you want to benefit from your opponent not knowing what the hell you're doing and not knowing how to play against something and not really expecting to get rogued or whatever, you can absolutely do that. This deck does points well, it does points in a way people don't expect, and it has interaction that people don't expect. That is enough for a deck to be good. The issue is, once it becomes well known, will it be able to maintain that? And I think that is a much harder question to answer. This is the deck with the lowest win rate I have ever put on this show. That includes that Ultron Killmonger Galactus deck. This deck is somehow worse. When I checked, there were 400 games of this list. It has 400 games in top 10% infinite since the patch. That's insane, right? It has a 39% win rate. I'll kind of just let that hang there. Like, I don't really know what else to say. Don't play Mill. Just don't do it. There's not, like, I know people are gonna be like, oh, well, that's a bad build of Mill. They're all bad. Don't do this. It's not good. It's not a good thing to do. It's just awful. You're playing so many bad cards in an extremely high-powered metagame. It's just like, okay, cool, great. I'm not drawing a card one time. I don't care. Don't play Mill. I'm begging you. Like, I know there's going to be people who are in the comments like, no. My Mill deck is good. Please play something else. 39%. This is only on here because I feel obligated to point out that people are playing it and beg them to stop. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. I have a couple of thoughts before I let you go. I do want to talk about this metagame because I feel like we are very much in a duopoly right now. And I don't want people to like hear that and get all mad because it's a better gameplay experience, in my opinion, than it was with Ella and Clog around. But it was sort of a four-opoly, I don't know, quadumvirate, I don't know the word, before this, where it was like Agent Venom decks, and then War Machine decks, and then Hela, and then Clog. Two of those are gone. And now it's a duopoly. And I'm not really sure that that's necessarily the most fun environment for people to be in, but what I will say is the amount of actual games of Marvel Snap that I play has skyrocketed. Yes, there are like two major lanes to be in. There's a lot of exploration still to be done in both AV and in the War Machine deck spot. And I think that the games you play against them, with the obvious exception of the ones where you get comboed, are actually very interesting and fun. And I think that on the whole has left me a bit rosier on this metagame. Now, realize I'm grading on a curve a little bit here because I'm grading it against a metagame that had more non-games than anything ever. Like, I'm grading it against a Hela Clog metagame, which is just heinous and awful. So I realize that, like, yeah, that's probably like a little bit worse than I'm giving it credit for. The other thing that I really wanted to highlight, though, is, and I mentioned this at the outset, we kind of talk about pay to win, right? Because it feels like Agent Venom just is the guy, and he is on the season pass. And I realize people have different expectations of what pay to win means. And I think a lot of people who are like Dolphins will be like, well, actually, it's good that he's one of those and not a card that's in the caches. And a bunch of people who are free to play will be like, are you joking me? I literally can't get him. What I will say is if you're ever going to break your free to play, this is probably the card to do it. And I think that it is just wildly and unbelievably strong. But what I like about it, honestly, is that it's strong in a way that encourages playing the game Marvel Snap. And we just haven't seen enough of that recently. Like, it is, if I had to guess, probably a balance issue. I don't know that for a fact. I don't have access to any numbers, but just to my mind, I feel like it's probably a balance issue. But it's the kind of balance issue like Sage, where it's like, okay, yes, it probably is, but also you're playing normal Marvel Snap, and we like it when that is happening. So I'm sort of ambivalent on it. With all of that said, thank you so much. I've been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.